Hello all, this is Al Finch. Today I thought I would bring you a top 10 RPG artists that brought me joy. Now, this is going to be a little different than other people's top 10s. I'm not doing it in who I think is the best artist to the worst or anything like that. I'm going to be doing this chronologically, basically in the order in which I was exposed to them. So let's get started. You might be wondering why I've got a comic book sitting here instead of role-playing game supplement if I'm talking about role-playing game artist, but I suspect that my first exposure to a Dungeons and Dragons artist was encountered as an ad in the pages of classic Marvel comics like this one. These ads would run in different pages, different comics, sometimes the center of the book, sometimes the back, and they were serialized. They were running these in 1981 and 82. They featured the artwork of Bill Willingham, who also contributed to various books and modules. But I didn't know that at the time. I didn't play D&D. I read comics before I played. And I remember being incredibly curious about what Dungeons and Dragons was. These ads were very effective. They showed the adventures of a cleric, a magic user, a warrior, and an elf in a dungeon, various mishaps. It drove me semi-insane because occasionally I would miss the ad. My comic book reading habit wasn't very consistent at that point, and so there would be gaps in the story. I don't think I finally read the full series of ads in order until the 21st century, unfortunately. But yeah, they were still cool. They still made me want to play Dungeons and Dragons, or at least find out more about it, even if I didn't quite understand what it was. Now, what did I play when I first started playing? Well, these came out in 1981 and 1982. One then might surmise that I first started playing then with 1983's Redbox edition. You can see here is the famous cover drawn by Larry Elmore. I was very pleased to bump into him at Gen Con and managed to get him to sign the cover of my player's handbook. This was my first exposure to Dungeons and Dragons. I was originally a player. My father was the dungeon master, and this was the only thing that I had to read related to Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't have Dungeon Magazine or Dragon Magazine, didn't have any of the modules. I wasn't even allowed to read the Dungeon Master's handbook that came in the box set for fear that I would learn its dark secrets and metagame against the monsters. So that being the case, I read this cover to cover over and over and over again because I thought it was so wonderful. So cover was by Larry Elmore, as some of the interior illustrations were as well. And also the interiors were done by Jeff Easley. Both of these artists end up shaping my early views of Dungeons and Dragons. And many of their illustrations are still what come to mind when I think of Dungeons and Dragons art to this day. I played through the solo adventures. I got to have my heart broken the same as everybody else, meeting the cleric Alina, who defended us against the evil wizard Bargle and then paid for it with her life. I remember seeing the rust monster that you would find in the solo adventure and wondering what the heck was up with that. I remember seeing the iconic character portraits. To this day, when somebody says cleric, this is what comes to mind is Elmore's portrait. And then a close second, Easley's rendition of a slightly more smug cleric. Yeah, this was my D&D, and this will always be burned into my mind as the best art. Tastes may have changed in the modern day, but I really love this stuff even now. I eventually transitioned to the second edition. There I became the dungeon master. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that both Easley and Elmore contributed to the second edition handbook that came out later in the decade. Here I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition with Easley now getting an iconic cover and Elmore contributing to the inside. Here's one of his full page portraits that really stick in the mind. More artists contributed to this book as well, but it was really those two with their, fantastic characterization that that captured me once again. So the second generation book did not let me down. I was very pleased with it. At around the same time I started playing second edition, I started reading Robert Asprin's myth books. And so I eventually found the Myth Adventures comic. What is this to do with RPG artists? Well, Myth Adventures, the adaptation of Robert Asprin's book series, was drawn by Phil Foglio. He depicted a young wizard's apprentice and his master, a demon. Skeeve was the apprentice, and Oz, I believe, was his master, trying to survive in a crazy world. And I loved it. I loved the kind of goofy stylings. I didn't consider it serious art at the time, but in retrospect, this is real artistry. The expression, the fluidity of motion, nothing looks stiff, and it made me laugh, which, Phil Foglio is a master comedian. You probably noticed my my background for most of my videos. This is a Phil Foglio art, not from Dungeons and Dragons, but from Magic, which is also where I encountered a lot of his work. But I eventually did find his work in like the Dragon magazine. I know that he would do a number of covers for issues of Dragon. He also did a series that ran in Dragon magazine called What's New. And there's collections of these around. What's New, all right, featured Phil and Dixie, which would be, playing various games and talking about them, all with Phil's classic artwork and humor. Very good stuff. And, there's several editions of this. That's one of two. They would actually show some of the covers on the inside if you get these collections that he did for Dragon. And they would also annotate if you get certain editions. So if you wanted to learn about their experience, I think it was this version here, working on these different comics, then there is a annotated version where you can get a little bit of extra background and history, which I thought was really cool. There's a third edition, but it does mainly feature their work from the Duelist magazine and Inquest magazine. This is actually where I first encountered What's New, was in the pages of these Magic, the Gathering related magazines. And I went back, of course, and sought out the Dungeons and Dragons strips. All right, near the end of my time with second edition, I managed to acquire this book. This one is Errol Otis's cover to Deities and Demigods. And this is course, a highly sought after book because of copyright issues. It was never reprinted in an intact form after the first edition. And that was all I had really seen of Errol Otis up until that point. I was not aware of his work on prior editions of Basic Dungeons and Dragons. I'm well aware of them now, and have managed to pick up some copies with his own iconic covers, the red book and the blue book, and of course all of the modules that I started to track down over time. Palace of the Silver Princess, Castle Amber, the Hidden Shrine of Tamo-chan, Dwellers of the Forbidden City. These are all classics, and I was always thinking that Errol Otis's art was pretty cool. But nevertheless, this is not where I saw most of his work. I actually saw more of his work after Deities and Demigods in the OSR movement, the Old School Renaissance. We started seeing his work crop up in Swords and Wizardry books, or books published by Goodman Games. One of my favorite interiors that he ever did was for the Dungeon Alphabet that they put out a while back. Here showing the Infernal Machine. So, yeah, wonderful work. Kind of experienced it backward with seeing his newest stuff and having to track down his older stuff later. Also in the OSR, I started bumping into the actual creators more often at conventions. I had the pleasure of meeting the gentleman J.V. West and playing with him a number of years back, using some of his supplements from his zine, Black Pudding. I loved his artwork from the start. It strongly reminded me of Foglio's stuff. Very cartoony, but very fluid, very good at conveying humor and very expressive. So I kind of gravitated to it right away. I played in games hosted by him at the convention a few times. Really enjoyed it. I encourage folks to track down his work, his zines, if they're still available. All right, wrapping up. Probably ought to mention my artists that I work directly with, or at least in cahoots with, and so to speak. Artists that brought me joy were the artists that illustrated my own works, right? Aaron Alfrey was the artist on my first book that was published, Big Puppet. My cosplay that you may have seen pictures of was derived directly from his cover. He produced an enormous amount of work for this book, much of which I can't show directly because of its graphic nature, but really just prime stuff. And I was so happy to have him work on the project with me. I first encountered him in certain pages of Lamentations of the Flame Princess works, and when he said he was interested in working with me, I was extremely happy with it. Artists that created work for my Temple of the Worm, they were two different folks, one for the cover and one for the interiors. The cover art was Paul Lane, who I must say just nailed it, took my description and produced almost exactly what I had hoped for with his work. And then the interior art was by Jacob Farrell. He did a very good rendition of the aliens that are found inside, and I enjoyed his depiction of them as two-dimensional beings inflicting pain on people from the shadows. So yeah, I was very pleased with how that turned out. And of course, my latest work, all of the work, the covers and the interiors, were done by a good friend of mine, Lucille Lachance. All of the various body parts, gratuitously and interestingly illustrated throughout the book. And of course, the saint himself. Very good stuff. And I am grateful to all of the artists that worked with me. All right, I believe that comes out to roughly 10. Hopefully you enjoyed this kind of walk through memory lane with me. If you enjoy this, I encourage you to check out my other videos. If you have reminiscences about your own experiences with role-playing game art, please do chime in the comments. I'd love to hear what your artistic journeys were like as well. All right, that's it. Ta-ta for now.